Hello and welcome to DSR's Need to Know. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and this week, as every week, we're going to have an in-depth conversation with a newsmaker we think you need to hear from. This week, we're especially happy to have with us Representative Adam Smith. Adam is U.S. Representative for Washington's 9th Congressional District. He is a Democrat and the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. How are you today?
I'm doing great, David. Thanks.
It's good to see you. I'd like to start with what is, the leading story in the news right now, and that is apparent breakthrough to get to a ceasefire in Gaza, which will result in the release of the remaining Israeli hostages in exchange for some Palestinian prisoners, and Israel pulling back to a line where they would still have direct control of about half of Gaza, and then to begin a second phase of negotiations. What's your feeling about this and where it may lead?
Well, number one, it's an incredibly positive step. I mean, simply to stop the fighting, given the humanitarian catastrophe that is in Gaza right now, and also that conflict's undermining of all manner of different other diplomatic things going on in the region with Syria and Lebanon, Iran. I think it's a positive step. The key is the next step, and the challenge has always been to find an alternative to Hamas to govern in Gaza. And the challenge there has also been Prime Minister Netanyahu's unwillingness to pursue that alternative, to finding every alternative unacceptable. So will we be able to break through that and actually legitimately push that alternative? That's going to be the next key step. And then, the issues between the Palestinian people and Israel are, intractable might be too strong a word, but very, very difficult to resolve. This is going to take a lot of time, patience, and persistence. So good first step, long way to go.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I know of you and think of you as somebody who is more strategic in his thinking than a lot of your colleagues may be. But it does seem like we are at a bit of a turning point in the power dynamics of the region. And in fact, the Israeli strike on Hamas and Qatar may have been the last straw which pushed Trump into putting real pressure on Netanyahu, which got us here. But the Israeli relationship has changed somewhat because of how they've conducted this war and eroding support in the U.S., and Netanyahu has not been exceptionally reliable as a partner. Meanwhile, other countries in the region have played a central role in getting to this negotiation and also in counterbalancing Iran, whether it's Qatar, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, Turks, etc. It seems to me there's kind of a rebalancing going on. Do you share that view?
Yeah, no, there is, and this is a key hope for the future in terms of how things have shifted. First of all, with Assad gone, Hezbollah substantially weakened, Iran weakened, and the willingness of those nations you just mentioned to work together and to work with Israel in a way that they haven't in the past is a real opportunity. I mean, imagine a world where Syria and Lebanon have functioning governments that are simply focused on governing themselves and not, destroying Israel or outside. I mean, that would change the Middle East in such a fundamental way. It would also give Iraq an opportunity to get there. I was in Iraq earlier this year, and amazing progress being made there, but you still have all of these Iranian-backed militias spread throughout the country. Are they going to be there to destabilize and export revolution, or are they going to start worrying about just making Iraq a good place to live? There's a real opportunity here. But Israel has got to show some restraint going forward in order to realize that opportunity. And we'll see. Netanyahu's got another year before the next election. Where do the Israeli people wind up? I mean, Israel's attacks on Hezbollah, Israel's attacks on Iran and Hamas have given an opportunity. They've opened this window to some degree, and I don't think we should ignore that reality. But if they don't figure out how to make the peace, then that's going to be all for naught. I mean, I said Israel's really good at breaking things. They got to get better at fixing things. This is, Lebanon back in the early 80s. Okay, you drove the PLO out, great, but then you left a chaotic mess in its wake that gave rise to Hezbollah and a major threat from Lebanon that lasted another, almost 40 years. So will they work with those partners in the renewed engagement you just described? I mean, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, these countries are showing a willingness to put their money where their mouth is and be actively engaged in solving these problems that they had not been willing to do in the past.
Yeah, and I think, if there is going to be a phase two, they will end up having to bear a lot of the burden for rebuilding the region. They will then be into this solution much more heavily than they ever have been in the past, and aligned much more closely with President Trump and the U.S. than they have been in the past. And that gives them all a stake in providing kind of counterbalance to that Israeli inclination to break things, which could be stabilizing. I mean,
Look, I've been to the region several times in the last couple of years, and things that really struck me about Saudi and the UAE in particular is they have one singular goal: stability to enable economic growth. Whatever things may have been going on in the past, and it's not to say that they're not still authoritarians, there's corruption issues, but they are laser-like focused on building a strong economy that will last past the point where they can no longer rely on oil. And to do that, they need stability. They cannot afford to have wars popping up in the region all the time. So they're much more invested in trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than they've ever been before.
Yeah, and they also have, if they're betting heavily on things like AI, they need technological cooperation with the U.S.
Yep.
And so they, which is also something they've made a bet on. And I think, it's very tempting to look at this in terms of the past 2 years of fighting. But if we pull the lens back, it looks more interesting. Now, I know that you have been doing a fact-finding mission in Asia recently, and I'd like to shift my focus there. It relates to this because, of course, the Chinese are kind of our main competitive rival on a lot of these AI issues. But, for the past few years, there's been a kind of a consensus within the leadership of the national security community that China is the emerging primary rival to the United States, and that we needed to refocus in order to be able to deal with that. Interestingly, we're hearing rumblings that there is a national defense strategy coming out, which calls for a refocusing of our military on problems close to home, the border, even some of these enemy within problems, which we should certainly talk about, or problems in our own near or abroad in Venezuela and other kinds of regions. And it actually, again, according to reports, narrows our concerns with regard to China to the issue of Taiwan. And I'm just wondering if coming out of this region, you're comfortable with that rumored approach.
Well, as the cliche goes, there is a lot to unpack in that question. I was in Beijing and Shanghai for 5-6 days. First House Congressional Codel that had been there since 2019. There'd only been one Senate one that Senator Schumer led a couple years ago. Main goal there was to open up lines of communication and begin dialogue between leadership in China and the U.S., which I think is crucially important. But then you take a step back and say, what are U.S. national security interests? And there's sort of two pieces. One is the broad picture, and then second is the narrow picture of what Trump is doing with the military now and refocusing it domestically that you raised. The broad picture to me is the U.S. still has the same interests that we've had for the last 80 years. We have an interest in the, again, cliche, rules-based international order. a global economic system that allows the free flow of goods, a robust supply chain, peace and stability in as many places as possible, so we can do business and grow economically. I think that's still our interest. What we have now is we have China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea who are challenging that order to a degree that we have not seen, even during the height of the Soviet Union, because there's a level of cooperation, and it's economic, not just military. You've got the BRICS countries forming to try to figure out how can they perhaps create an alternative to the U.S. financial control of the world. So we're being challenged in that way, and the question is, how do we meet that challenge? And my take on China, yes, China is the biggest threat in the sense that they are the most capable of the group, without question. Economically, certainly, but their military is growing as well. But in terms of their worldview, China also presents an opportunity in that China basically wants the same thing that I just described. They want a stable global international order so that they can do business and grow economically. It's what they want. Now, they want a greater say in it. They think that the U.S. Has too much control over that. But I think that's something there's an opportunity for us to work with in a much, much more direct way than we can with North Korea, which is just sort of a crazy, isolated, nuclear-armed country that is very dangerous and unpredictable, or Iran that is trying to export revolution and really destroy things, or Russia that has dreams of reconstituting a Russian empire and doesn't really want to play by any rules whatsoever. So I think trying to figure out some way to talk with China to say, hey, if you want stability, Russia invading Ukraine is not stability. Iran destabilizing a half dozen countries around it, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, that is not the stability that you want. We got a long way to go, but I think we should open up that dialogue, which pivots us to what Trump is focused on. And I want people to understand one thing. Trump is primarily focused on his own power. That's not that he doesn't have policy thoughts about immigration or drugs or any number of different things. But Trump is about his own ego and his own power. He wants to control the U.S. military, and he wants the U.S. military to do what he says whenever he says it. And that is a big part of how he is structuring. That's this whole ridiculous conversation out in Quantico last week. It's, you're my military, you'll do what I tell you when I tell you. And part of that is giving him greater domestic control. And I think we should be very afraid of what he's doing with the U.S. military domestically. I can easily envision in a contested election him claiming that there's unrest in all of these places, so the military needs to come in and settle it. And he wants them to be loyal to him if that comes to pass. And I am not a panic, hyperbolic sort of person. It's not the way I approach things. I try to solve problems, work with people, and be reasonable. So I'm calling it as I see it, not just to try to scare people. I think there's real concern about what Trump is doing with the military in that regard. And I think that's a big part of the reason why he wants to consolidate power here locally, why he's sending the Guard to Chicago and Memphis and Los Angeles and Portland, and doing all of that. As far as the war on drugs that he is launching, I think there is a legitimate concern there. Obviously, fentanyl and drugs are a major problem in the U.S. Is the U.S. military really the solution to that? Does it serve U.S. interests to get into a shooting war with every drug cartel in the Western Hemisphere? I don't think it does. I don't think it's going to solve the problem. I think it's going to alienate neighbors and make the problem worse. And it will also distract us from the fact, shifting back to the global problem, we need to be able to deter our adversaries. Part of getting China to the table to have that discussion that I mentioned earlier is having a credible threat to say, no, China, you can't just take Taiwan. You can't just take the territory that you want that now belongs to Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Russia, for that matter. So we need to have that credible deterrence, and we sure as hell need to have a credible deterrence in Europe, given what Putin's ambitions are. And if we distract that to fight a war that we cannot win, we are not militarily going to be able to stop drugs from coming into this country. that's as much of a demand problem as it is a supply problem. I think there is real risk that that weakens us in Russia and Asia and undermines our overall national security strategy.
Yeah, I remember once having a conversation with you in which we both said we were drawn, I think, a little bit to national security because it was one of those places where politics would get set aside, where there were common interests. People would talk about the common interests. We had a shared interest in safety, security, prosperity here in the United States. And of course, we're in a moment of maximum polarization. And when I see, the president declaring, the opposition party in the United States or people who protest against him to be enemies, talk about invoking the Insurrection Act, talk about a war in Portland. You're from neighboring Washington. I probably was news to you that Portland was a war-ravaged city. How is it on the House Armed Services Committee? How is it, because you have a reputation for being rational and able to work with your colleagues regardless of political party for the reasons I was saying earlier, and yet we're at this moment of polarization. And it's like, can we together manage our national security successfully when such divisions are so, prominent?
It's getting difficult. I will say that the House Armed Services Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee are still sort of the last bastions of bipartisanship. Mike Rogers, who's the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, I could not ask for a better partner. He is sincerely interested in working together to meet our national security needs. We've got a big piece of legislation this year in the defense bill on acquisition reform that could really put the Pentagon in a better position to more rapidly acquire the innovative technologies that we're going to need to meet our national security needs now going forward. We still work together. We still have rational conversations, but it's getting more difficult because the Republican leadership is 100% partisan. We try to fight them off, keep them out of our work, but inevitably they insert themselves and undermine the bipartisanship of the committee, number one. Number two, Trump's extreme approach is making it harder and harder because as bipartisan as the House Armed Services Committee is, the Republicans on that committee will not challenge Trump. They may not like what he's doing, they won't say it out loud, and they won't challenge it. The one area they did challenge Trump on Ukraine, that seems to be bearing at least a little bit of fruit at the moment, in that the president is softening his pro-Putin stance. He's still not anywhere near where he needs to be on that conflict, but they've pushed back on that. But when it comes to sending active duty Marines into Los Angeles, when it comes to taking money out of our national security budget and shifting resources to the border, long after the president secured the border, he's still taking hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of troops and redirecting them towards the border so that basically our troops can, hang out on the border and just sit around and watch stuff. They're not doing anything down there. The Republicans are not willing to stand up against that. And I'm worried. We'll see. The shutdown fight right now, I think, is going to be really telling. Do the Republicans come across at all and negotiate with us, or do they continue their hard-line Trumpian stance of here's the budget, you Democrats just have to eat it? Now, the problem with their theory on that is we don't. Okay, the Senate Democrats, the 7 Democratic votes that they need in the Senate, they don't have to vote for that. And they're not going to unless some sort of conversation opens up. But I guess I would sum all that up by saying that bipartisanship that is so central to national security and so central to the way the House Armed Services and Senate Armed Services committees work is hanging on by a very thin thread right now.
But doesn't anybody, you talk to Republicans off the record, people that you get along with, doesn't anybody say, there is no war in Portland? We know there's no war in Portland?
Yes.
Now,
look, here's part of the problem. This takes me into more of a domestic direction. how to put this exactly without getting myself in trouble. The left side of our political spectrum has advocated policies that I don't agree with and that have undermined, a number of different important issues in this country. And there is a legitimate concern about that. No, Portland is not a war zone. Yes, Portland is a very poorly run city that has not handled their drug, homelessness, and crime problems anywhere near as effectively as they should have. Same can be said of Seattle, by the way, an area that I represent part of, and King County. I think left-wing policies that search for defunding the police and abolishing the criminal justice system, and that have undermined the concept of accountability and personal responsibility, have made crime a bigger problem. Now, all that, I want to be clear, I support alternatives to incarceration. I think mass incarceration in the 90s and early 2000s was a major problem that could have been corrected. But you don't have to overcorrect to no accountability and no responsibility. And we're wrestling with that issue right now. But the one thing I will say, there is no way on God's green earth that the United States military makes that situation better. They are not trained in domestic law enforcement. It is illegal for them to engage in domestic law enforcement, and they make it worse. I came up with a pretty neat summary of how I view the crime problem. Crime is a problem. Fascism is not the answer. More police and stronger communities. That's the answer, and that's what we need to work on. But Trump's not doing this because he wants to reduce crime in Portland. He's doing it to enhance his own personal power over the U.S. military and over the country. It is, and I don't agree with everything that J.B. Pritzker says, but he's absolutely right. This is an effort at pushing us towards martial law and an authoritarian government run by Trump instead of run by the Constitution and the laws of this country, and we ought to be very concerned about it.
Yeah, because it is exactly the same tactic used by Mussolini and the fascists in Italy when they started identifying their opponents as national security threats and putting them in jail as a result, and taking steps exactly like this. Let me shift the focus a little bit from there to another national security related issue that you touched upon, and that is the apparent willingness of this administration to, blow up fishing boats, in the Caribbean without any kind of due process, without sharing any evidence that the people on the boats were in fact drug smugglers. And even if they were, there are issues of extrajudicial killing that enter into this. Is this the kind of thing that you think there is a concern about among your colleagues, or is this the kind of thing that's being shrugged off as Trump and Hegseth being Trump and Hegseth?
I think the Republicans are shrugging it off, and I think that's a mistake. Democrats are distracted by a lot of different issues. I and several others are very focused on it and very troubled by it. But it has kind of flown underneath the radar. When the president's out there invading Portland and, all the other stuff he's doing and using his Justice Department to arrest his political enemies, trying to shut down media that disagrees with them, believe it or not, blowing up people in the Caribbean off the coast of Venezuela is a little bit under the radar, but it should be higher in our concern level. Because, the president these are extrajudicial killings. There's no other way to describe it. That this is not legal in any sense of the word. There is no way on earth that a boat that wasn't even headed to the United States, by the way, and let's assume for the moment that the facts were correct and it was, part of a drug cartel. I'll get to that more in a second. There's no way that is a threat to the United States, an imminent threat. What they mean by imminent threat is someone's coming to directly kill Americans. There's no way that this is justified. We should be trying to stop drugs, and we have law enforcement means of doing that. Using lethal force in this context is a dramatic expansion of what should be allowed where lethal force is concerned. And then there's the second point that you very correctly raise. We don't even know exactly what's going on here. They have provided no concrete information on who exactly it is that they think they're fighting, or what evidence they had to show who these people were on these 4 boats that were blown up. We had President Petro of Colombia today saying that there were Colombian citizens on some of those boats, so it wasn't just Venezuelans. So we don't know. That evidence has not been provided. And look, I've worked a lot on counterterrorism stuff and analyzed a lot of strikes that have been taken in a lot of countries. And the work that is done on who it is that we are hitting and who they are connected to and what they're doing is incredibly detailed in every briefing I've ever seen. Here, there's just no detail. They claim, well, they're part of, and I forget the name of the gang. I read an article about it, but I can't remember the drug gang they're talking about, the drug cartel. They're just saying, it's this drug cartel, they're part of it, we blew them up. Well, who? How'd you track them? Who are the people on the boat? Where'd they come from? How are they connected to this major drug cartel? How is that drug cartel connected to all the rest of them? So they seem to be just shooting from the hip on this one. And lastly, I would say it ties back into just the general consolidation of power, authoritarian approach of Trump. I think he wants this to be like that, because basically he says, why did I do it? Because I wanted to and I can. And that's all you need to know. Well, that is not the way the United States government is supposed to work, and it's going to have blowback throughout Latin America. We're going to alienate those countries and those partners while China and even Russia and to some degree Iran are trying to develop inroads down there. So this has huge implications for our national security.
Yeah, so, everything that you talked about, concerns me, and your perspectives on it are clearly welcome. But the only way that one can counterbalance the sort of power play that you're talking about that's available to us is via legislative mechanisms, and opposition doesn't really control or have much leverage in the Congress right now, or via elections. And so it raises a question. What do people in your district care about? Of the issues we've talked about here, do any of them resonate? I hear a lot in the media, oh, well, people, don't talk about democracy or fascism. People don't really care about that. And yet the people I know, that's all they talk about. But, I'm an East Coaster. You're a West Coaster. You have a district you go to and you live in and talk to these people. What do people care about right now?
Get to that in a second. I think the most important thing to think about here is, to counter this, we have to build a very, very strong coalition that opposes what Trump is doing. That's what we have to do. Now, you're right. People ask me all the time, well, what can we do about Trump sending troops to the cities? What can we do about Trump blowing up boats in the Caribbean? What can we do about Trump using the FCC to threaten the media? And, I can give a very legalistic legislative answer. There's all manner of different pieces of legislation that a lot of us have introduced and co-sponsored that would restrict the president's power on tariffs. We could pass a resolution that would do it. But, the Republicans don't support that. What we lack is a large enough coalition to support all of those efforts. All right? So we have to build that coalition. And how do we build it? Well, I think there's a 4-step process to this that has to recognize that by and large, people are concerned about Trump, but they're more concerned about the Democratic Party. It's a horrible example, but I always use Bill Barr as my favorite example here. Bill Barr wrote this book shortly after the first Trump presidency that basically absolutely skewered Donald Trump. Just said he was a child, the worst president ever, talked about all the terrible decisions he made, the terrible way he ran the office. And then Bill Barr went around for a year doing things like this, podcasts. Everybody say, hey, God, here's my book. Trump, he's terrible. And then Bill Barr endorsed Donald Trump. And he explained it in one sentence, or actually, I think 4 words. The left is worse. That's the way he explained it, all right? So we got 2 jobs here, and that is to go after what Trump is doing and convince people that we have a reasonable alternative. And the 4-step process is, I think we have to talk about both Trump's authoritarianism and his threat to democracy and our Constitution and his policies that are harming America. I don't think it's a choice. And I get in these debates all the time with pollsters who say, well, they care about kitchen table issues, care about this. I kind of agree with Steve Jobs to a certain extent, who always said, customers don't know what they want until you show it to them. All right, it's the old joke about Henry Ford, who said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Okay, so you've got to lead to some extent. You can't just sit there and put your finger up in the wind and go, what are people talking about? You have to show them that you have a vision, an idea for where you want to take this country. So I think it's perfectly appropriate for us to say the authoritarianism that Trump is doing is a real problem, and then you connect that to the policy. All right? When you have an authoritarian who's making tariff decisions based on his own personal whims, that drives up your prices. All right? If you take Congress out of it, that impacts your life in a real economic way because he's causing massive inflation and devastating our economy. All right? You connect those two things. So it's authoritarianism and it is bad policy. You know, he is zeroing out all of these energy alternative programs for wind and solar because he doesn't like alternatives. Well, right, even if you want to drill, baby, drill, you need all the energy you can get. He is driving up energy prices because on his own personal whims, he's canceling $10 billion in energy projects, many of which are almost done. And I get my kilowatts and my gigawatts mixed up. But anyway, these things are going to put power onto the grid. And he's taking it down because he's a frickin' dictator who doesn't care about it. So connect that and make that case. But then the second part is we have to present a reasonable alternative. And I think part of presenting a reasonable alternative is to admit our mistakes. Okay? 80 million people or so voted for Trump. They're not all racist, bigoted, horrible, awful people. A lot of them didn't like having an unsecure border. A lot of them didn't like all of the crime, homelessness, drug abuse, mental health problems, and unaffordable housing that was growing up in cities run by Democrats across this country. A lot of them don't like radical identity politics that says that if you don't think and speak exactly like the left does, then you will be labeled a racist and a bigot and shunned in our society. They had reasons. We have to show that we hear them, and we're going to address those issues. And we don't think everyone who thinks that there should be restrictions on immigration is a bigot. We don't think that everyone who owns a gun is a school shooter. We don't think everyone who considers themselves to be a solid Christian is somehow a white Christian racist nationalist, all right? We've got to work on that piece. And then the fourth piece is Democrats need to get better at how we campaign. You and I have spoken a little bit about this. But trying to nominate Joe Biden, or actually I guess we did nominate him, when he clearly wasn't up to the job of campaigning, just showed a certain lack of seriousness on behalf of the Democratic Party that undermined people's confidence that we're going to do the job right, that we're going to campaign right, both tactically and strategically. We got to drive that message to people. In terms of what my constituents are talking about, I'm in a 70% Democratic district. They're talking about an authoritarian takeover of this country. That's the number one biggest thing that the constituents who talk to me are concerned about. Now, you got your silent group out there that isn't as active, and they're unsettled by the price of housing. They're concerned about the price of housing. They're concerned about the general cost of living and the fact that they're not making enough money to pay for housing and education and food and health care. I think those are the biggest things that are driving them, and they don't think Trump's doing a good job of addressing those issues either. But it's a package. It's not one or the other. And sorry, one last point on this. Democrats need to stop, saying, "Oh, we shouldn't be talking about authoritarianism. We shouldn't be talking about this. We should be talking about all of it." But we should talk about it within a narrative frame that shows people that we know where we're going. So I think we're getting better at it. I think this shutdown fight is crystallizing some of those issues. We're focused on health care, which people can relate to, but we're not just focused on health care. We're focused on a variety of different things that Trump is doing in his budget that we don't support. So that's how I try to approach that issue, and I think it is the central issue of the moment.
Well, I think that was a great summation of how to approach it. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell our producer, let's go out and put this out there right now. Sometimes we take part of it and we put it out early and the rest is behind a paywall and it waits. I don't want to do that. I want to get it all out there now because I think you've just explained in the clearest and most concise terms possible what the approach that Democrats or people who care about democracy in America need to take, and people who care about the United States playing a constructive role in the world as it has in the past need to take. So I'm extremely grateful for it. We've taken too much of your time as it is, but perhaps we can lure you back for more of this conversation.
Anytime.
It's great to see you again. Great to talk to you. Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back with many podcasts, including 2 this week that are going to be special podcasts looking with experts at what's going on in the Middle East. So join us for those, whether you listen via podcast or you're listening on YouTube or on Instagram or on other platforms. Until then, thanks. Bye.